Assalamu alaikum. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tariq Khalil, and this is our 8th educational webinar titled The One State Apartheid Reality. Now, what is apartheid? Two sources of international law lay out the definitional framework for apartheid. The International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, popularly known as the Apartheid Convention, defines the crime of apartheid as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court defines it as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regimes. So these two definitions are complementary as well as supplementary. The cornerstone of apartheid is purpose and intentionality. So in the context of establishing and maintaining racial domination imposed through an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression. The etymological origin of apartheid is Afrikaans, which means separateness or separate development, and was adopted by the white Afrikaner nationalists who came to power in South Africa in 1948. Thus, the word became associated with the apartheid regime of South Africa from 1948 to 1994. And this is the crucial point. Inhuman or inhumane acts committed in South Africa are illustrative and inclusive, not definitive and exclusive. South Africa is not the standard for what apartheid is. It's merely an example of it. It's important to note that apartheid is a crime against humanity and is prohibited under customary international law. This means that states are bound by the convention even if they are not parties to it, and must therefore adhere to its obligations. Apartheid is an international crime, and states can and must exercise universal jurisdiction over Israel's crimes. From the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, apartheid you will see. And to discuss this further, we're joined by our two wonderful panelists, Huwaida Arraf and Josh Ruebner. Huwaida is a Palestinian-American attorney and human rights activist. She's the former chairperson of the Free Gaza Movement, and from August to December 2008, led 5 successful sea voyages to the Gaza Strip to confront and challenge Israel's illegal blockade on the approximately 2 million Palestinians living there. She was one of the primary organizers of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla and was traveling with it when it was lethally attacked by Israeli forces on May 31st, 2010. She is the co-chair of the National Lawyers Guild Palestine Subcommittee and sits on a number of organizational boards, including New Generation for Palestine, Eyewitness Palestine, and on the advisory board of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. In 2020, she was a Bernie Sanders delegate to the Democratic National Convention. We also have with us our very own Josh Ruebner. He's the managing director of AMP, adjunct lecturer in Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University, and author of Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace, and Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State. He is the former policy director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and a former analyst in Middle East Affairs for Congressional Research Service, a government agency providing members of Congress with policy analysis. Thank you both for participating in this very important discussion. I want to ask you both a two-part question, and Huwaida, we'll start with you. Can you expound on this concept of apartheid and how it applies specifically to Israel? Also, why is it essential that we conceptualize the oppression in Palestine through the apartheid framework and the apartheid lens?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm kind of honored to be speaking next to Josh on this very important issue. So expanding on the concept of apartheid, it is exactly what you said in terms of, defining it as a systematic, like a regime of racial domination and using inhumane acts in order to maintain that domination over another people. you have a misconception that apartheid only applies, and it comes from, I think, relating it too much to South Africa, where the Black and colored population were the majority, and yet they were oppressed by the white minority. And that is nowhere to be found in the definition of apartheid. It is just one group that is using inhumane acts in order to maintain their domination, perpetrate their domination against another people. And for a long time, this was not applied to Palestine for a variety of reasons that I don't know if we have time to go into. One of them being this idea that the West Bank, Gaza, and now what is considered Israel in 1948, Palestine, is not a unified kind of entity. And therefore, you don't have this initial oneness where you then have a group that is coming to instill this separateness and use these processes of oppression in order to separate and dominate. You had this idea that the West Bank and Gaza is temporarily occupied, and there is a desire for separation, and that completely separates or ignores really the onset of the problem, where you had a group of settlers largely coming from outside and attempting to displace the indigenous population, before you ever had this idea that, you know, we'd have a small percentage of Palestine becoming an independent state. And so over the years, you had different frameworks kind of applied. And what we have now, I think, is the international, specifically the human rights community, coming to the conclusion that the things that we've used before is just no longer sufficient. One of the things that I've been kind of arguing or stating to people is this: although we have for a long time, and we continue to argue, that Israel's policies violate international human rights and humanitarian law, sticking to that framework is no longer, it's no longer enough. The concept and the law of occupation was never conceived of and articulated in a way to take into consideration what Israel has been doing. Occupation, military occupation, is for the most part considered legal. It is a state that comes about after usually international armed conflict. You have a situation of apartheid, you have a situation of occupation that is then governed by international human rights and humanitarian law or occupation law until the sovereignty can be turned over, or the territory can be turned over to the rightful sovereign. Now, Israel never intended for that. And you can see that by kind of following the trajectory of Israel's action, statements from Israel leaders going back to the founding, fathers of Israel, that they intended to displace the population. You have something more akin to settler colonialism. And therefore, just sticking to that international human rights and humanitarian law framework leaves out a whole area of law and rights that also apply to Palestinians, but have not been advocated for adequately. And so now that this realization is coming to fruit now, and I think you will be seeing, we had the B'Tselem report recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Israeli human rights organization coming out saying this is apartheid. I think soon you will also have similar reports and statements by other international human rights organizations. I expect Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others to be saying the same thing, because this is really what you have. And as you said, it's a crime against apartheid. It opens up another way to think about the rights that Palestinians are being denied and the ugliness of it outside of just this framework that Israel has been trying to push, really, that it is in a conflict with the Palestinians and they're fighting, and that there is Israel tries to say that they are implementing or using only the policies that it has to use in order to maintain its security, etc. And it wants to peacefully come to a resolution with the Palestinians. That is not their intention, and the crimes that they're committed are much broader than that. And so I think this goes to the second part of your question, is why is it important that this framework is applied to Palestine? Because it allows us to get out of just these these limited rights that Palestinians are being denied, and look at this as a system of oppression rather just than one body, you know, the occupying power, Israel, that is violating the rights of Palestinians, and whether they are kind of justified in doing that or not justified in doing that. It is a deliberate and very systematic and systemic policy that is being applied in order to maintain domination. So let me stop there because I know we'll be getting to other parts that I touched on briefly. And I'd love to hear what Josh has to say about this.
Thanks so much, Tarek, for having me. And it's great to be with you, Huwaida, and everyone watching here at home. The reason I think that apartheid is important as a term for discussing Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people is because I think that there's enormous power in how we name something and how we frame something. So if we frame this as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that implies a certain symmetry between Israel and the Palestinian people, and it implies a traditional interstate conflict. Now, obviously, we know that that's not the case, and we know that conflict is an inappropriate frame for discussing Israel's relations to the Palestinian people. And so by taking this frame of apartheid, we have a much better descriptive term to understand and to analyze Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people, not just in the context of its military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, occupation that's been ongoing since 1967, but to understand the totality of Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people wherever they exist, whether they live under military occupation, whether they live as second-class citizens of Israel, or whether they're refugees who are not allowed to return to their homeland from which they were expelled by Israel in 1948. And so the use of the term apartheid, I think, helps break down this liberal notion that has held in mainstream US discourse for a long time about there being an intrinsically good Israel within its 1949 armistice borders and a bad Israel, which represents its colonization and military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Apartheid allows us to step back and see these policies as a whole. And I think it's very significant that B'Tselem talked about between the river and the sea in their report, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And I think that the other reason why it's so important to use this apartheid frame, and before I get into that, I do want to mention one other thing about understanding this as a totality of policies. Of course, Zionism unself-consciously viewed itself as a settler colonial movement and appealed to the European powers on that basis of being a settler colonial movement. We see that through Herzl's diaries and letters and so on and so forth. But even before the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 and the dispossession of the Palestinian people through the Nakba, we saw how the Zionist movement sought to create separate and unequal structures in Palestine. So, for example, I'll point you just to one. In 1920, the Zionist movement founded the Histadrut, which was and is the primary trade labor union organization, first in the Yishuv, in the Jewish society in pre-state Palestine, and today in Israel. From the outset, the Histadrut did not allow for Palestinians to join this trade union. It was conceived of explicitly and only as a trade union for Jewish people in Palestine. So even before the State of Israel was founded in 1948, we see these exclusionary institutions that are set up by the Zionist movement, which were translated into separate and unequal policies in 1948. So when we talk about the law of return versus Israel's unwillingness to allow for the return of refugees, that's a separate and unequal policy that was pursued. When we look at how there was a regime of military rule imposed on Palestinian citizens and only Palestinian citizens until 1966, that too was a form of separate and unequal rule. So it's a structure and a wording that allows us to understand more holistically Israel's oppressive policies toward the Palestinian people. And I'll say one more word about the importance of the apartheid framework, and that is this. apartheid is an extremely dirty word in the international lexicon today. As you mentioned, Tariq, at the outset, it is a crime against humanity. And so when I think Israel and its supporters look at the trajectory of what happened to apartheid South Africa, they become very, very concerned by being tarred with this same term of being an apartheid state. Because let's not forget, up until a few years prior to when the US slapped comprehensive sanctions on the apartheid regime in 1987, up until a few years before that, South Africa was viewed in terms very similar to what we understand in terms of the US-Israel relationship today, in terms of a special relationship, in terms of being the United States' best ally in Africa, and all that changed very quickly. So this is something that Israel's leaders and its supporters fear becoming delegitimized, just like apartheid South Africa was.
Thank you so much, Josh and Huwaida, for highlighting what I think is the most important part, which is the all-encompassing nature of the label of apartheid. The fact that it covers the whole of historic Palestine. The best-selling piece, the basic conclusion of the best-selling piece, was that Jewish supremacy, and they used the term Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So just to quote them briefly, the best-selling position paper said there is one regime governing the entire area and the people living in it, based on a single organizing principle, advancing and cementing the supremacy of one group, Jews, over another, Palestinians. Very, very simple and to the point. And they barely even mentioned South Africa. It was just an aside near the end of the position paper. So can you speak to that piece and why it's so crucial that an organization that was founded on focusing on the military occupation element of the problem to now focusing on the more all-encompassing nature of it from the river to the sea? Anybody can tackle that first.
Do you want to? Okay.
Start talking.
I think it's important for a few different reasons. One of them, because B'Tselem is a human rights organizations, they do focus on the law and have focused on, Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. And I mentioned how just the occupation law has been insignificant because it just doesn't describe some of the other things that Israel has been doing. And the fact that it's an Israeli human rights organization, I think also lent it greater credibility, even though it must be said Palestinians have been saying apartheid, and more for a long time. But as it goes, it's, when the Israelis say it, people pay more attention. So I think that is significant. And then the paper goes through and highlights the various ways that Israel is not just violating the rights of the Palestinians in the occupied territory that's recognized as the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, but you have these policies that also discriminate against citizens. And how do you talk about that when you only focus on occupation law? How do you talk about the rights of refugees? How do you talk about the right to be reunited with your family when you're only focusing on occupation law and how this might apply to Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza? So B'Tselem before has talked about, for example, the fact that the West Bank Palestinians and Gaza Palestinians can't get together. But what about the fact that you have refugees that haven't seen their family members that live inside what is now Israel and supposedly are citizens with equal rights, but can't exercise that right to be reunited with your family because of specifically what they said, these laws that are designed to maintain Jewish supremacy. And you just can no longer escape the fact that it applies throughout this territory of historic Palestine from the river to the sea. And if I'm going to give you sometimes it helps to have some concrete examples when you're talking about such a topic like this. Israel frequently talks about how it is a democracy and how it treats the Palestinians, its citizens so well. Of course, they refer to them as Israeli Arabs to try to erase this a connectedness of the Palestinian people with Palestinians living inside Israel. And we can have representatives in the parliament, and we can vote, and all of these things. And I say we because I happen to be a citizen of Israel, but completely glosses over or ignores the fact that you have laws on the books that discriminate against Palestinians, specifically based on the fact that they are not Jewish. And sometimes these laws are clear on their face, sometimes they're more obscure. They appear to apply to everybody, but because of the special status that you have within Israel, if you are Jewish, it doesn't actually apply to you. And one example that I give is one of my own, which Israel has this policy of you can't pass along citizenship to your offspring. You can only pass it along for one generation unless the child is born inside Israel. So it came to affect me when I was having my first child. I got my citizenship through my dad, even though I was born inside the United States. But when it came time for me to give birth to my children, it dawned upon me that I can't have them in the United States if I want them to have citizenship. And why do I want them to have citizenship of this state that is oppressing my people? Because that would be the only guarantee that they could go home to and know their extended family, because Israel systematically denies Palestinians the right to access our historic homeland. And so I had to make the decision to go there in order to have this child. Now, on the books, or to both my kids, on the books, it seems to apply to everybody. You can't, the citizenship can only be passed on from one generation if born outside the country. In reality, a Jew anywhere in the world can claim automatic citizenship just by coming to the country, whereas Palestinians who have hundreds and thousands of years of history of being in this territory, of being on this land, cannot. And therefore, who cares, if a Jew had you can't pass on their citizenship, their child can come at any time and claim automatic citizenship, where my child would be denied that kind of access. And they have 60 other laws right now that, like that, either on their face or in a more obscure manner, discriminate against the Palestinian citizens. And you needed a way to talk about that also, and to include that. And as you mentioned, and Josh mentioned, the refugees are also part of this, quote unquote, problem. And the traditional framework of just occupation law was no longer significant. And as I said, Palestinians have been crying it for a long time. B'Tselem has come out, and I expect more will come out. Now our job is to make the politicians that actually can have an effect on pressuring Israel to change these policies or to dismantle these laws, convince them. And one of the ways, and maybe we'll get into this later, as citizens of the United States specifically, and even citizens of around the world, is really getting rid of this, the two-state solution being the only solution, because clearly it's not.
And before you go ahead, Josh, it's 65 laws, by the way, Huwaida.
It's 65 now.
But go ahead, Josh.
Thanks. Yeah, first, let's recognize what is and what is not exceptional about B'Tselem's report. As Huwaida mentioned, it's not exceptional in terms of breaking new conceptual ground and understanding of the issue. And of course, the lived experiences of Palestinians for more than 7 decades gives ample evidence and proof of how Palestinians have viewed being separate and unequal under Israeli rule throughout all that history. So I 100% agree with everyone who's offered up a very valid critique and say, why does it take an Israeli organization to validate and amplify what Palestinians have been saying for decades? And there's no new facts that are revealed by B'Tselem's report. And for those of us who have been doing this for a while, I mean, it's all quite well known what was rehashed in this report. So in this respect, that's not groundbreaking. But I'm a big believer in yes and. So you can have two separate things that are equally true. So yes, it's true that Palestinians shouldn't have to have their perspective validated by an Israeli organization. And this report is also extremely groundbreaking and important in its own right. And I just want to say again what the tagline to this report is, because I think it's so important. The tagline of the report was a regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. So let's unpack some of those words for a minute, because I think they are all extremely significant. First of all, you notice that they didn't call Israel a state, and they certainly didn't call Israel a democracy. They called it a regime. And in the rhetoric around politics, a regime is something that is by definition illegitimate. So by calling out Israel as a regime, B'Tselem has delegitimized Israel as a so-called democracy in the Middle East. Let's also unpack the phrase Jewish supremacy, because I think this is extremely important as well. And I think that there's a parallel between what B'Tselem is doing here by saying Jewish supremacy versus the racial reckoning that we are finally beginning to undergo in this country after 400 years of abuse of the indigenous inhabitants and Black people in this country. Just as the murder of George Floyd touched off this national conversation that we're still in the midst of having, for the first time, many millions and millions and millions of white people in this country are starting to reckon with the notion of white supremacy, to come to terms with it, to understand how they are privileged in this white supremacist society, and to work with people of color to dismantle this white supremacy to create a more just society. So the fact that B'Tselem chose to use the word Jewish supremacy to parallel this, I think is an indication of where things need to go when you talk about the conversations that need to happen within Israeli Jewish society in order to develop a whole new understanding and perspective of how to reorient relations with the Palestinian people on a just basis. And then finally, the other thing I'll say about the significance of the tagline, I mean, we already talked about the significance of using the term apartheid, so I won't say anything more about this, but saying that it's a regime of apartheid from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. I think this is extremely, extremely important recognition on B'Tselem's part, because they, for the first time, have recognized that there is one totality of rule, and it's Israel's apartheid rule over all of the Palestinian people. That apartheid is not restricted to the West Bank and Gaza, but it encompasses all of Israel's policies. So I think it's a really, really significant report. And I know for a fact that members of Congress and their staff who are progressive, they listen to B'Tselem. And when they see this report and when they read this report, I think it's going to have profound implications on US policy. We've already started to see some members of Congress come out and name Israel as an apartheid regime. So things are changing for the better, I think.
Yeah, and actually, you answered the follow-up question. There is, what is the political, what are the political implications of this report in U.S. political and media discourse? So, I mean, if it's going to have that kind of impact, then in that sense, it is absolutely essential to have a report from B'Tselem. Huwaida, did you want to respond to that? Want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's great. I agree with what Josh says. I just hope that for Israeli citizens, it doesn't take like for US citizens here, white Americans, 400 years. But it's not, I don't know how much the average Israeli citizens or most Israeli citizens, unfortunately, give B'Tselem any credibility. You have this reality in Israel amongst Jewish Israelis that they just are becoming more extreme. They don't care about Palestinians. They absolutely approve of kind of separation and laws that discriminate. And we see them repeatedly electing outright proud racists to lead them, and public opinion polls in Israel just show even the young that are outright racist and don't see their Palestinian neighbors, Palestinian citizens of Israel, much less the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, as being anywhere equal to them. Of course, that's not all Jewish Israelis, and we have a lot of great comrades and people that put their life on the line to stand with Palestinians, and those that also go to jail for refusing to serve in the military or for being arrested, protesting with Palestinians. But the majority continues to harbor this supremacist mentality, and to them, Palestinians are get in the way of exercising that, and whatever their government needs to do to get rid of this, the problem of the indigenous people is being tolerated, and that is alarming. That is sad. But one of the good things is, and not even one of the good things, but something that is positive that goes along the line of what Josh was saying is, I think there's the opposite trend happening worldwide, and specifically in the United States, with Jewish Americans, specifically young Jewish Americans, in that they are one of the leading voices today against Israel's policies. And that is, that I think is indicative, or that supports the kind of work that needs to be done from outside and the pressure that needs to be done from inside, from outside, because from inside, with the Israeli population, the Israeli citizens, the trend, as far as I see, doesn't seem to be going that way. I don't know if Josh would agree with me on that, but from my time that I spent there in the occupied territory, and even from what I continue to read from outside, it's not great. The pressure needs to come from outside.
No, absolutely. And it helps to dismantle the democracy label that Israel so proudly stands on, or tries to at least. So, and one thing I wanted to highlight to the audience is that Josh's book, Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State, this is going to be part of our fundraiser. So you can get a signed copy. You can support AMP's educational work by donating $50 or more. And then the website, I believe, is right there. And Josh will send you a signed copy. Josh, get your wrist ready. I don't know how many books you're going to end up signing. So please go and check that out. And okay, before we move on to another point here, there's something very important that the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute intentionally omits. And that is the numerical component of this, that our political discourse love to stand on as though it is relevant in any way. So they'll say that, well, in South Africa, it was a white minority, and then the oppressed was a black majority. Whereas in Israel, and now they're focusing within the Green Line, they'll say, well, it's a Jewish majority, so it can't be an apartheid regime. And this intertwinement of predominant group with majority group is something that scholars highlighted a lot. You can be the numerical minority and still be the predominant group. So I believe it's that kind of confusion that can cause our discourse to just, lose sight of what the term actually means, and actually trivialize what apartheid actually is. It's more than just mere discrimination. It's not just racism, because that's how it's trivialized. Well, there are many countries that are racist. Why are you only focusing on Israel? You're singling Israel out. But apartheid is a regime, an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression. It's a very specific standard. Can you speak to those types of talking points that kind of gear us away from what's really at hand and cause a distraction and don't really touch on the issue?
Do you want me to? Okay, I'll go first again.
You're always first, Huwaida, from now on. Okay?
Thanks. I think that's true, and I think that is one of the things I started off with saying, is that many people have this misconception that in order to be apartheid, it has to be a minority that is oppressing a majority, and that's absolutely not true, and that's why it's not found in any of the definitions. It's just one racial group that is using systematic oppression to dominate another and to maintain that domination. It doesn't matter if you're the majority or the minority. You can be the minority and be more powerful. You can be the majority. It doesn't actually matter. And the fact is that Israel became a majority by kicking out and killing the indigenous Palestinians. So they started off as a minority. They killed or expelled 750,000 Palestinians to start off, and they continue this policy of whether inside the West Bank and Gaza, or even within 1948 of driving Palestinians out, making it so it is undesirable. It is almost impossible to continue living in this area. And we talk a lot about the violations of people living in the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza is basically unlivable now, and people need to think about how to leave just in order to survive. But inside 48 also, again, Israel created this large refugee problem. You have now 7 million Palestinians refugees worldwide, more than the Palestinians in the whole of historic Palestine. And they are part of this issue and are, also need to be worked into how the definition is applied. But the other thing that we need to the other thing that I wanted to mention is also inside 48 or within Israel, Israel says it's a democracy, right? But it does not really guarantee the rights of the minority. When you think of a democracy that is to be lauded, you want to ensure that the rights of the minority are also respected. Inside Israel, Palestinians that become part of the parliament are frequently vilified by their fellow parliamentary members. Imagine a Palestinian member of the Israeli Knesset for proposing, instead of the Israel nation state law, which says that only Jewish Israelis have a right to nationhood. Instead of that, the Palestinians proposed a constitution where all citizens of the state are equal. And they were berated, kicked out of the legislative chamber. And they are vilified within the legislative chamber and out. And they are very restricted in what they can even do, to the extent that Palestinians are frequently questioning, do we even take part in Israeli elections, and legitimize this farce that it is a democracy, as people understand democracy, where even minorities are, the rights of minorities are respected. Here it is not. Israel institutes policies, 65 of them and other, where Palestinians can't do anything about them. And their policies intended to keep Palestinians as a minority, as no more than 20% of the population. And without these basic protections for the rights of the Palestinian minority, they will always be a minority. So it doesn't matter that they are, it's the minority that's being oppressed here, because of kind of what I've stated, that the Israel is set up in a way that they will always, inside 48, remain a minority. Inside the West Bank and Gaza, they're trying to get rid of them. And worldwide, the refugees can't come back. These numerical kind of standards that are in people's minds do not mind. And I think that is accounted for in the language of the law.
And before you jump in, Josh, I want the audience to understand, and Huwaida mentioned this, but just in case it was missed, the 65 or so laws that Huwaida is talking about, those laws are Israeli civil domestic laws that apply to the Palestinians living inside the Green Line. So we're talking about those discriminatory laws that don't apply outside the West Bank. Those are military regulations that are more onerous, but we're talking just about the so-called citizens of the Israeli state. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, let's talk about who's a minority and who's a majority for a minute, because I do think it is extremely relevant to talking about Israel's system of apartheid over the Palestinian people. Let's not forget that on the eve of the UN partition plan in 1947, the demographic balance was 2 indigenous Palestinians for every 1 Jewish person in Palestine. And despite that being the demographic balance, the UN recommended that a Jewish state be established on more than 50% of Palestine, even though Jewish people only owned 7% of the land at the time. And if you actually look into the details of the partition plan, you'll see that within the so-called Jewish state that was allocated, under the partition plan, there was only a bare majority of Jewish people. So the idea of establishing a Jewish state, as Huwaida said, could only be predicated upon the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And despite the ethnic cleansing that has taken place from 1948 up until today, despite all of the massacres that Israel has inflicted on the Palestinian people, when you look at the global demographics between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, despite all that Israel has tried to do to eliminate the indigenous over the past 7 decades, you still have the exact same population percentage of 2 Palestinians for every 1 Israeli Jew. So understand that Israeli Jews are still a minority in historic Palestine when you look at the global Palestinian population. And I wanna give you just 2 brief quotes. One is from Hendrik Verwoerd. Hendrik Verwoerd was the architect of modern day apartheid in South Africa. He literally wrote the apartheid laws and implemented them in 1948, and he was the prime minister. Now, in a 1961 interview, he said the following, quote, "The Jews took Israel from the Arabs after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state." So here you have the architect of apartheid seeing in Israel a mirror image of the apartheid regime that he had established. And let me be very clear here. Here, I'm not quoting Verwoerd as any type of human to be emulated or commended. This was an evil fellow with who had pro-Nazi sympathies. I mean, he was just an execrable fellow. But the reason why I raised that quote is because there was a different quote, this one from Archbishop Desmond Tutu back in 2002 when he visited Palestine during the Second Intifada. And he wrote an article that was entitled Apartheid in the Holy Land. And he said that what he saw in Palestine, quote, reminded me so much of what happened to us Black people in South Africa. Now, if you can have polar opposites of Hendrik Verwoerd and Desmond Tutu, the architect of apartheid and the person who did so much to disassemble apartheid in South Africa, both agree that what they see in Israel's policies is apartheid, how can you contradict those two?
Absolutely. And I find it very, very promising that there is a change in our discourse with respect to this term. And I know you said that it wasn't ugly. Was your term ugly? I guess it's not as ugly as it used to be in terms of how it's characterized. So I want to shift gears just for a bit. Last week, the ICC issued an opinion on the situation in the state of Palestine. Now, the ICC made it clear that when it mentions state, it's not talking about any particular demarcated borders that is part of an ultimate settlement, but for the purposes of criminal jurisdiction. The occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, is subject to the court's jurisdiction. Now that Palestine has acceded to the ICC, has been recognized as a non-observer member state of the United Nations. How do you think this will play out? After all, we are talking about apartheid, a crime against humanity. Put aside all the other crimes that we can talk about. On this particular one, how relevant do you think this ICC decision is? Do you think it will lead to an investigation? What are the prospects for finally bringing Israeli personnel to The Hague? Huwaida, you're always first. I told you.
That's a good question, Tariq. I have read some comments that seem to question how this might play out with the conclusion by B'Tselem and others of having kind of an apartheid framework when which is built on or presupposes one regime dominating the whole territory, whereas the International Criminal Court has said that Palestine is a state for reasons of, or for the purposes of jurisdiction, at least in the 1967 borders. And therefore, there are some that see a contradiction there. I don't necessarily. How will it play out? If we have time, I can talk about the reasons why I don't necessarily see a contradiction, but how it will play out. One thing is that the International Criminal Court said that, yes, they are not making any kind of political decisions. One of the things that Israel tried to argue, and that where it continues to argue, and supporters of Israel, is that by the court getting involved here, it is going to be making political decisions, and this is, this is a conflict of political nature, and it is inappropriate for the courts to get involved here. The court response to that, which I think is very significant, is that in a lot of these cases, you have political issues, and therefore the judiciary can't retreat when it's confronted with facts that might have arisen from political situations and or disputes, but also trigger legal or juridical issues. So just because the situation arises from a political conflict, well, that's going to be the situation in a majority of the cases. So you can't say that then the court can't get involved here. And anyway, what they're saying is that we are not laying out we are not determining boundaries at all, but we are the question simply is, does the court have jurisdiction based on the Palestinians, the Palestinian accession to the Rome Statute? Are they a member now of the ICC for purpose of being able to give the court jurisdiction? And the court said, we're not in a place to review that. The Palestinians, the United Nations overwhelmingly in 2012 declared that Palestine is a state. And when Palestine kind of submitted its document to the Secretary General, to the UN Secretary General to be deposited, the Secretary General was carrying out the will of the United Nations General Assembly that Palestine is a state, and therefore for the purposes, so the Palestine acceded to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and that is the basis upon which you become a state for purposes of jurisdiction. Palestine did that. The UN and it reflected, and the Secretary General of the United Nations accepting that reflected the will of the United Nations General Assembly, and therefore the International Criminal Court is in no place to challenge that. So for purposes of jurisdiction, only Palestine is a state. Now comes another question that interestingly the court deferred, but I do think that when that question comes up, it'll also come down in Palestine's favor. And that is, whether then Palestine has the ability to give jurisdiction over to the court. That's kind of another question that they did not elaborate on. And I think that that's going to be deferred to a later time. But they did answer the question that Palestine is a state, and that it was confirming the prosecutor's own conclusion. The prosecutor had already come to that conclusion last year, but kind of wanted a backup, and she got it, and therefore it's unquestionable. And that's when other questions come up, I think that they will also come down, like I said, in Palestine's favor.
Josh?
I'll be brief because I'm hoping that we are able to save some time to talk about the U.S. policy ramifications of this. So just very briefly, the complaint that's before the ICC right now that was lodged by the state of Palestine covers three things. Number one, Israel's colonization of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Number two, its attack upon the Gaza Strip in 2014. And number three, the Great March of Return, in which Israel gunned down nonviolent protesters along the fence with Gaza. So far, the complaint does not encompass claims of the crime against humanity of apartheid. So theoretically, we could see another complaint come forward to investigate whether Israel is guilty of practicing the crime against humanity of apartheid. But because of the territorial jurisdiction issues, it would be limited to a discussion of West Bank Gaza policies.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you both for that. And just to reiterate the point, that the ICC decision did not just it highlighted crimes on both ends, so it tried to be even-handed in terms of how it would carry out its jurisdiction. So it's crimes from Israel as well as crimes from Palestinian groups. So that's how it was worded. So just in case people misunderstand the ICC decision on that front. Now I want to talk about the U.S. angle here. And Josh, you mentioned earlier that there are some members of Congress. I'm sure you can count them with one hand. I don't think it's more than that. Probably even less than that. That have used the term, that have referenced the term, and they're still in Congress. So it didn't have the ramification that it could have had maybe 15 or 20 years ago. So can you talk about the changing atmosphere actually within Capitol Hill, within our media discourse, within our societal discourse? And do you think that this term apartheid, now with the B'Tselem report, can have the kind of political traction that we see in order to fulfill Palestinian rights?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tariq. And I remember in 2006 when former President Jimmy Carter wrote this book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. It created this huge amount of controversy. And you would think that with the title of this book, it really focused in on Israel's apartheid system of governance toward the Palestinian people. But actually, if you look in the index, there's only 3 mentions of apartheid in the entire book, and one of them deals with South Africa. There's only 2 very vanilla references to Israel's practices in the West Bank. And of course, President Carter was of the notion that I talked about at the beginning, where it's good Israel within the armistice borders, but bad Israel in its military occupation. So what happened to President Carter, and what were the ramifications of him publishing this book? He was disinvited from addressing the 2008 DNC. That was an unprecedented slap in the face for a former US president not to be invited to address the DNC. You had such a huge pressure campaign exerted against Representative John Conyers to condemn Jimmy Carter's book. And this was such a disgraceful chapter. So why was John Conyers targeted in this way? He was targeted in this way, number one, because he was the founder of the Congressional Black Caucus, and number two, because he was the leading voice against apartheid South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s in Congress, and played a large role in bringing about US sanctions against South Africa. Now, what I was told was that he would be stripped of all of his committee assignments unless he came out and condemned Jimmy Carter, which he did in his book publicly, saying that he was very disappointed and hurt by Jimmy Carter's terms. This despite the fact that John Conyers was one of the politicians in Congress who was at the forefront of advocating for Palestinian rights. So I think it's poetic justice in the sense that after John Conyers resigned, he was succeeded by Representative Rashida Tlaib, because she has called out Israel as being an apartheid state, as has Representative Ilhan Omar, as has Representative Betty McCollum, who has authored these really path-breaking pieces of legislation promoting Palestinian human rights and really centering Palestinian human rights. So we don't even need to go back that far to see how much things have shifted. It's really been an immense shift in just a decade and a half. And the reality is that policies take time to change. As I said earlier, we're 400 years in to a system of white supremacy in this country, and white people still haven't thought our way out of this conceptual box in which we're trapped. So the fact that you have this changing dynamic and calling Israel apartheid is something that sitting members of Congress do and still keep their seats, I think is a dramatic transformation.
No, absolutely. I want to read a statement that was put here, just because I believe that there was a misunderstanding. The quote is, This is a member from the audience. The Palestinians are one from the river to the sea and fragmented by different colors of identity cards. Israel has built this virtual reality in which they create the illusion of having Palestinian citizens. So half the population is in a minority. The Arabs are only a minority based on false presentations, ignoring the existence of most of them. We should speak in terms of decolonization and indigeneity, I think is what that, or indigenization, sorry. So can you guys just elaborate on that point? I think I brought it to the fore by talking about the predominant versus majority distinction, but Huwaida?
Yeah, no, I think the comment is absolutely right. And I think that we both did touch on that, but our comments should not be misunderstood. Specifically, I think both Josh and I pointed out that Palestinians do constitute a majority, but they have been fragmented. You have Israel, which is keeping Palestinians a minority inside 48. You have Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza that are separated, and that Israel's instituting policies intended to get them to leave. And then you have the 7 million Palestinians that are outside. The refugees are not allowed to return, and they are very much part of this equation. But when we say the minority majority doesn't actually apply to we're also making a distinction and saying it doesn't even matter. Palestinians are a majority that are impacted by Israel's racial and inhumane policies, but even if they weren't, it wouldn't matter, because the language of the law does not mandate that it needs to be a minority oppressing a majority.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with Professor Kaspari's remarks there. I think they were on point, absolutely. And I'll go back to my yes and framework. So yes, the framework of apartheid is a very good frame to use. And the frame of settler colonialism is also a very useful frame to understand Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people. And the way I understand Israel's policies toward the Palestinian people is as a mix of settler colonialism and the logic of the elimination of the indigenous combined with apartheid policy. So yes, one way that the settler colonial power tries to eliminate the indigenous population is through divide and rule. And yes, Palestinians as one whole people are fragmented into an untold number of different situations and statuses because of Israel's apartheid rule. So I don't see the lens of apartheid as being contradictory to the lens of settler colonialism. I view them as being complementary.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's important to point out that when we talk about the Palestinians in this fragmented way, we're referring to how they have been fragmented, not that we view them in a fragmented sense. But that's exactly what Israeli policy has been, and that's exactly where this Bantustanization label has its relevance, because the same, and this is where the analogy truly comes in with South Africa, creating these Bantustans, now divisions within the West Bank, where Palestinian communities are pretty much cut up and non-contiguous. So, this is one of the crucial inhumane acts that the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute mention. Now, before we go, I want to focus on, or just very, very briefly talk about how this apartheid label, how can we use it in our discourse moving forward? I mean, because there is this charge, and stop me if you guys haven't heard this, of anti-Semitism for those that use the term apartheid. How can we combat? How can we get around this label of anti-Semitism to stick? Because we want the younger audience, we want college students to be able to pick the right framing and to discuss things in an honest way and not be labeled anti-Semitic. Huwaida?
I'm going to let Josh go first on this one.
She deferred, Josh. Go.
Well, I'm a big fan of George Lakoff and the way he uses language and framing. So when he talks about don't think about an elephant in his famous book, if you say to yourself, don't think about an elephant, don't think about an elephant, what's the first thing you're going to think? An elephant. And it's the same thing when it comes to these oftentimes spurious charges of anti-Semitism directed at people who criticize Israel's apartheid regime. Now, let's not forget the fact that there are real, actual people who are anti-Semitic who advocated for Palestinians, not because they care about Palestinians or their human rights, but because they have an anti-Jewish agenda. So let's recognize that that is a thing, but it's not a thing that is remotely more than something marginal to the Palestine solidarity movement. And people who have that perspective have been pushed to the side and to the margins of the Palestine solidarity movement, as it should be. So, number one, I would not recommend countering with, I'm not anti-Semitic, because this is like Richard Nixon, saying, I'm not a crook, because when Nixon said, I'm not a crook, what was the first thing that came into everyone's mind? He was a crook, which he was. So we don't use other people's framing to explain our framing. So, we simply state the facts. We can use the Sullivan's report to speak for itself, I think, especially to Jewish people, who might be concerned or upset with this framing of Israel as an apartheid state. Look, this is a Jewish Israeli human rights organization, the most well-known, well-respected of the human rights organizations in Israel. So, if people are not going to take their word for it, I don't know what you can say to convince them other than to insist upon a fact and insist upon a way of acting in a way that you yourself are not partaking of anti-Semitism or invoking anti-Semitic tropes when you're discussing Israel's apartheid policies toward the Palestinians.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I want to add also to that, actually urge people to take into consideration the policies of the new administration that we have in the United States when it comes to framing Israel as an apartheid regime, when it comes to instituting policies that could pressure Israel, like BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which this administration, Biden himself, has come out against, although he says that he will uphold the citizens' rights or Americans' rights to First Amendment rights and rights to boycott and things like that. But he stresses more that these kind of policies border on anti-Semitism, and that needs to be countered, I think, anytime it is said. And because we were also talking about the ICC, although that's a little bit separate, I didn't see yet that the Biden administration has lifted the US sanctions on the ICC, which is very problematic. I think the last thing I saw was back in January, where they will review. There shouldn't be anything to review. The International Criminal Court should not be sanctioned for carrying out its work. The US, more than anything, is politicizing it. But then again, this is not anything new. We talked a little bit about the Apartheid Convention. The United States voted against the Apartheid Convention in 1973. Of course, they were outvoted, and it was passed. The United States still has not ratified not even ratified, but just become a party to the Apartheid Convention. So U.S. policies often counter, I think, U.S. rhetoric, and we need to, especially with this administration that likes to present itself as an administration that is going to right the wrongs of Donald Trump and put us and restore the U.S. respect in the international community and the rule of law, etc. But when it continues to exceptionalize Israel and to indicate that anything people do to try to hold Israel accountable for its massive human rights violations is anti-Semitism or should otherwise be fought, I think it is incumbent upon us to counter that at every chance we get and to not let that go. And I think a lot of people probably that are listening here are already very active in that, but I wanted to underscore that.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you both for your wonderful presentations and tackling this very, very important issue. I mean, I still have like 3 more pages of stuff to go over, but we don't have the time to do that. I want to thank you all. I know this is a very important topic, and I'm glad I had the honor of having you both here to talk about it. One last point, and I'm just going to reiterate this again. Josh's book, Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State. Donate $50 or more to support A&P's educational work, and he will send you a signed copy. So please get online, support A&P, support the work that we do, and get some knowledge. And read Josh's book. Thank you to Huwaida. Thank you to Josh. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.